You know, my father immigrated here in 1969. We came here in 1971. I was born in India. And we came to this country because of the promise this country held out for us as immigrants. Promise of education, promise of opportunity, a promise of freedom, a promise to be able to be who you want to be, a promise where you didn't have to fear your government. And so those were all the things that were very, very strong in my mind when I came here. So my expectation of this country are tied to those promises. But those promises aren't unique to me. That's the reality of every citizen in this country. So I think we're very unique in that way. But I sometimes think that we forget how lucky we are, because, you know, sort of like if you're used to having chocolate ice cream all the time, after a while you sort of get sick and tired of chocolate ice cream. Unfortunately, democracy is sort of like that. We may get lazy around it, but democracy is sort of like a garden. You have to sort of cultivate it. You have to weed it. You have to water it. You have to fertilize it. You have to do all sorts of things to make it blossom into what it really is, the promise to American citizens. So as an outsider coming in, I guess maybe it's much more raw and fresh and close to me when I think about it, maybe than some other people. But I also see what a wonderful gift it is for everybody who's here.
You mentioned that you immigrated from India.
Yeah.
But I've heard you speak about the incident when you were 8 years old.
Yeah.
You saw a public beating.
Yeah.
It was quite brutal. Can you just describe what you remember about that incident and how it sort of shaped your philosophy about justice and about democratic institutions?
Sure. Well, you know, it was something that there was a person who used to go clean people's homes, and one day, and he would go to different people's homes, and one day some jewelry came up missing in this house next door, and I liked him. He was a kindly old man, and he was a wonderful guy, and of course they immediately suspected him because he was a domestic person who came and cleaned their house. So the police were immediately called, and this poor chap was dragged out into the courtyard. And I remember as a little kid him being dragged out by these police officers and then being whipped by these sticks. And he sort of protested his innocence. He begged for mercy, and then he sort of confessed to everything to make the beating stop. And I remember talking to my uncle at that time. My father had already immigrated to the States, and I remember talking to him, and I said, well, who are these folks? Why are they doing this? And they said, well, a crime's been committed, and they're trying to get to the truth, and they're trying to find the truth so they can hold the right person accountable. And I said, well, who do these folks work for? And they say they work for prosecutors, and they sort of tried to explain that. And the impression that and so fast forward a few months later, what they found out is that this person never actually committed the crime. It was in fact somebody else. And so it left a very strong impression, because when you have public institutions, and those public institutions have tremendous power, then there is an inherent responsibility in the execution of that power. Because once you have that power, it is very easy to abuse it. And it's also important to recognize, compared to other forms of government and versus American forms of government, as that as a public servant, it is not your institution and it is not your power. You're a temporary caretaker. So even sometimes I say that I'm the elected district attorney, but I'm a temporary caretaker for 4 years till either I get to have this privilege again or somebody else comes and takes on that responsibility. It's never my office. It's really your office. And you just give me the privilege to be able to tend it for a period of time. And so to me, that was the thing that stuck in my head, that there are people whose lives hang in the balance with the authority that we have as public institutions. And it is incumbent upon us to recognize what the responsibility of that power is. And now for me, what that meant was, some people would say, well, that means you should have been a defense attorney. Well, to me, it meant to be a prosecutor, because as a part of this institution, justice and fairness and the rule of law is an affirmative obligation on me as a public prosecutor. So my relationship with my citizens is not just simply in the accountability of somebody who commits a crime, but it's also recognizing and honoring the principles of why I get to do my job as well. And the more I honor those principles, then I reinstill their faith in this public institution as well.
It's interesting to me that you have embraced democratic institutions in such a way, because it could have gone another way. You could have been completely distrustful of the government when you came here. Having seen what you saw in India, right. I mean, why did things turn out the way they did, do you think?
Well, I think because, look, I sometimes talk about it. I say, you know what the promise of American democracy is? When you think of other political institutions, it is who supports you they help you get elected, and then when you come in power, you take care of the people who supported you. But what's unique about the promise of American democracy is that even if you didn't vote for me, but I got elected, one of my first responsibilities is to come back to you who opposed me and to let you know that you're part of my political concern as well. And that, I think, is fundamentally unique of American democracy. So that is the idea that I embraced. To me, that the public institutions are really out there to serve our community in fundamental ways different than other power structures. And coming to this country, that was the promise that was there. And I haven't been disappointed. Now, does that mean that is our house perfect? That sometimes our structures need shoring up? But that is the work of democracy. That is the work of every civic responsibility of every citizen. This is an institution that does not survive by neglect, but it requires people to tend it and take care of it constantly. That's our relationship with our public institutions.
You mentioned you chose the path of a prosecutor. This year you've been busy.
Yes.
You've scrutinized West Valley City Police, the way they do their job. You've been investigating allegations of wrongdoing at the Utah Attorney General's office. You just gave the green light for Utah's first same-sex marriage. You probably don't want to comment specifically on these cases, but can you talk about how these philosophical views shape the way that you approach your job?
Sure. Again, as I said, another analogy sometimes I use is that when I got elected, I got 4 years of oxygen that was given to me. And as each year goes by, that I take a little bit more of it, and I don't know if somebody's going to renew my oxygen tank or not. So I think we get this opportunity. It's a privilege. And if you buy into the ideas of fairness, you buy into the fact that the decisions that you have to make are not decisions that means that it has to agree with everybody, but that you've been given a responsibility to try to make the best decision that you can. And if you're committed to that principle, that means you don't shy away from hard decisions, you don't shy away from your responsibility. And you may not get it right, or you may upset other people, but you do not abdicate the responsibility that's been given to you, because that trust has been instilled in you. So by me executing on that job, then it restores the trust back to those individuals. Now, how I execute that job is just as important. So I have to do it in a transparent, objective way, in a way that is fair and that my citizens understand. They don't have to agree with me, but they have to at least respect the fact that we are not shying away from making the tough decision in the best way that we can. So whether it is look, none of these things that you've talked about, anybody would want to say, well, these are the things that are first on my agenda. But when they present themselves to us, I volunteered for this job. And I think that's another privilege that we have in this society, that anybody can volunteer, and if they're lucky, they get that privilege. That means you embrace the challenges that come to you, and then you execute on them, and then you let our citizens judge the fairness of it, but you let them know that you're on the job to do what's necessary.